see it. So, so with that, Dr. Lott, we're really ready to go on tech right now. We lost about a half an hour of time from 1 to 1:40 trying to get all of this to work. So we are good to go. So I will turn it over to you. And
Okay.
thank you for staying with us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you all again. I wish I was there in person. But as was mentioned in my first lecture, I tried to give you a very short introduction to kind of the problems with analyzing data and how to understand data. I could have given a whole semester class just on that. But now I want to try to go through some specifics. I guess a copy of a book, my most recent book, is on available for you all to kind of look through more of this stuff in depth. But what I want to try to do is just first of all have a short video that talks about where people get a lot of the perceptions that they do about guns. Obviously, it's not just from the news; it's also from entertainment. My guess is the entire debate that we have right now would be very different if the media covered some of these things differently than they do. So I just want to start with that, and then I'm going to go through a number of specific claims that have been made to kind of give you an idea of where those types of claims come from and what are some of the issues with them. So this first video is about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Hollywood hates guns. Well, they like them in shoot 'em up movies. But as soon as it comes to a good civilian using a gun for self-defense, Hollywood turns anti-gun.
She shot herself.
Why the gun over?
Hollywood constantly portrays people who hate guns.
I'm not a huge fan of weapons. Now do you see why I don't like guns?
You don't like guns either.
I'm not a big fan of guns. I don't like it.
Why'd I leave the FBI? Guns, mainly.
It's almost as if they're trying to condition people to hate guns. In Hollywood, even Navy SEALs warn against owning guns.
I need a gun to protect the kids when you're not around.
You'd be dangerous to yourself and to the kids.
The wise law enforcement experts constantly urge people not to use
But
them.
in my experience, the problem with carrying a gun is that eventually it will go off.
But Hollywood gets this backwards. In real life, police strongly support civilians owning guns and carrying them for self-defense. A recent survey by the National Association of Chiefs of Police polled thousands of sheriffs and chiefs of police. 76% believe that qualified, law-abiding armed citizens help law enforcement reduce violent criminal activity. Detroit's police chief urges people to carry guns.
So good Americans who are responsible with concealed weapons can make a difference.
He became chief and encouraged civilians to carry guns 6 years ago. Detroit's murder rate fell since then.
I'm excited about our trend downward.
Nationwide, rank-and-file cops show even stronger support for private gun ownership than do police chiefs. More than 90% supported civilians carrying guns. No surprise, Hollywood's cops are wrong, and real-life cops are right. Police are informed by what they see on the street every day. They know how important having a gun is to their own safety, and they know that private citizens can help.
We've seen our good Samaritans. We've seen them go to the aid to others because they were good Americans with concealed weapons permits.
Many Hollywood crime show writers clearly know nothing about guns and crime. The myths they push on people are endless.
What else do we know about these guns?
This is the machine gun that Davis was firing at us, the so-called cop killer.
Stop. Since 1934, there are only 2 known uses ever of a machine gun being used in a murder. Yet Hollywood shows criminals using machine guns to outgun cops all the time. Hollywood also finds endless ways to insult civilians who are using guns.
No good's gonna come from you guys running around here with assault rifles. We're prisoners who are on the loose. We got a right to protect our neighborhood.
Yeah, that's a job for law enforcement, not a ragtag militia.
Hollywood plays to bigoted stereotypes, depicting gun owners as dumb hicks.
You got one. Got a fugitive. Hey, get off me, man. They do anything. Officers, please. Hey, let him go. That's not who we're looking for. I kept telling him that. You sure? He looks guilty as hell to me. At least check his papers.
Let him go.
In real life, citizen volunteers and neighborhood watch programs save lives. A 2008 U.S. Justice Department analysis found that crime fell 16% in areas that started a neighborhood watch program compared to those that did not. Some of Hollywood's bias is comical. In this show, a woman asks a federal agent if he's worried about not having his gun in a gun-free zone when he's facing professional killers.
You sure about this no guns thing?
Bad guys won't have them either.
Bad guys won't have them either? Seriously? Has a bad guy ever seen a no guns allowed sign and turned around? In the show, the killers obey the signs and leave their guns behind. But in real life, gun-free zones only encourage criminals. They serve as a magnet for criminals. Virtually all the mass public shootings in the United States since 1950 have occurred in places where general citizens are banned from having guns. The Virginia Beach shooting this year was another example of this. A woman who worked at the municipal office building talked with her husband the night before the attack about bringing her permanent concealed handgun to work for self-defense. But she decided not to because of a city rule against carrying guns. She and 11 others were killed the next day by a disgruntled coworker. In another recent case, a doctor carried a gun anyway, despite his hospital's no-gun policy, and he stopped a mass public shooting. As the district attorney put it, if the doctor did not have a firearm, he'd be dead today. And I believe that other people in that facility would also be dead. That real-life situation would make a gripping TV story, but don't expect to see it. Hollywood bias is everywhere, and it endangers lives by misleading people on guns.
All right. Well, I just mentioned one or two other things beyond what's in the video there, and that is my center. We did a kind of a deep dive looking at all the entertainment cop shows on ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox during the 2021-2022 television season, and 86% of the guns that were used by criminals in those shows were machine guns. You know, you watch a show from, Magnum PI or something, and you'd think that there are more people killed with machine guns on a Sunday in Hawaii than have been killed in the United States as a whole since the 1930s. The other issue I just bring up quickly is the gun-free zone issue. And it's this notion that economists refer to as kind of marginal deterrence. And that is, there's a reason why these criminals go and target these gun-free zones. And that is, if you take something like the Covenant school shooting this last year in Tennessee, if you were to take a gun into a gun-free school zone, that's a 6-year prison term that you face there. For you or I, 6 years in prison would completely change our lives. We would be felons at that point. And the issue that you have is that for this murderer, let's say the murderer had lived, they died, they were murdered, they were shot to death by the police. But let's say that they had lived, they'd be facing 6 life sentences or 6 death penalties. Does the notion that taking 6 years away from their 7th life would be a deterrent, that they say, well, I can live with 6 death penalties, but you take away 6 years from my 7th life, and that will deter me from committing the crime, just isn't serious. And so what you've ended up doing, I mean, despite the intention to try to create safe areas, the gun-free zone actually accomplishes the opposite, because the only people that it's imposing a real penalty on are the law-abiding good citizens, not the criminals. And all it does is ensure that the criminals that take their guns into the area will be the only ones that are armed. Their goal is to get media attention. And they know the more people they kill, the more media attention they can get. You'll frequently see statements like, if I can only kill more people than such and such did, I'll get more media attention. And they know that the more people they kill, the more media attention they'll get. And they know if they go to a place where their victims are banned from having guns, it's going to be easier for them to go and kill more people and get more media attention. So I wanted to kind of go through and talk a little bit more about these mass public shootings, these mass shootings, because the way these terms are used, I think a lot, are very misleading. People don't understand the different definitions that are used. So in January, the Biden administration finally put out its report on the Uvalde school shooting from about 2 years ago. And in the president's statement on that, he said over the last year since Uvalde, our country has experienced a staggering 650 mass shootings. You could look at something similar after the Lewiston, Maine bar shooting in end of last October. CNN put out a statement that there were 586 of these mass shootings that year. So what they'll say is, you've had something like Uvalde where 21 people were murdered. We've had 650 since then, or CNN or New York Times or Washington Post will go and mention a mass shooting like the Lewiston one where 18 people were shot to death in the bar there, and they'll go and mention that there are 586 of these. The thing is, I would argue you're really comparing apples and oranges on these things. The source for both the president and the different news outlets, when they frequently make these claims, is from a gun control group called the Gun Violence Archive. The Gun Violence Archive defines a mass shooting as 3 or more people injured and or killed. What you don't understand is that about 80% of their cases involve gang fights over drug turf, and most of the rest involve things like robberies. And when they say injured, that doesn't even necessarily involve people who are shot. It could be people who tripped and fell and got hurt when they were running away from the shootings. By contrast, the FBI has a very different definition of shootings. So they have a couple different definitions. One is active shootings, and active shootings are cases where somebody's been shot at. Could be anything from one person being shot at and missed all the way up to a mass public shooting. But most importantly, it involves cases that don't involve another crime. So they exclude cases like gang fights over drug turf or robberies, because they're trying to get at those types of attacks where the whole point of the attack is to go into a mall or a movie theater or a grocery store or a school, simply with the idea of trying to go and kill people. And they're looking at public shootings. Now, the FBI also has this term mass, which they add to these things. So these mass public shootings are 4 more people killed in a public place, not involving some other type of crime like a gang fight over drug turf or a robbery. And it's not that the FBI doesn't think that gang fights over drug turf are horrible and it's bad that people are being killed in those types of situations. But they're trying to distinguish these cases because the causes and solutions for these cases are very different. If you look at something like gang fights over drug turf, it's pretty easy to explain why those go up and down over time. It's basically the profitability of selling drugs. As the profitability of selling drugs goes up, you'll see more gang fights against each other in order to try to control drug turf. As the profitability goes down, there'll be fewer of those. When you're talking about these mass public shootings, as I was just mentioning a minute ago, it's overwhelmingly people who are suicidal, but they want to get attention. They'll frequently say that they're unappreciated, or girls won't go out with them, or something like that. And they want the media to talk about them having existed. They want that type of attention. And so how you're going to stop those is you have to take away the media attention they get. And the way they think they get media attention is by killing more people. And so if you can stop them from killing more people, for example, getting somebody there quickly on the scene to stop the attack, you'll be able to stop. So just give you an idea of the difference. So, you know, I just was mentioning cases of 650 or 586 mass shootings by the Gun Violence Archive. If you take mass public shootings as 4 or more people killed in a public place, not involving some other type of crime, over the last 25 years, you're talking about between 1 and 8 of those cases occurring in any given year, with an average of over 2 of those cases. Now, when I worked at the U.S. Department of Justice, and my time, is something going on there that I should know about?
No, I'm gonna go shut the door.
And my position was I was senior advisor for research and statistics in the Department of Justice. And one of the tasks that I had was to go and look at these FBI active shooting reports. So the FBI over the 9 years from 2014 to 2022 says that there were 302 of these active shooting attacks. You know, just as comparison, you have almost, according to the Gun Violence Archive, you have almost twice as many of those occurring in any given year as compared to over the 9 years, you have 302 occurring according to the FBI. And again, these are anything from one person being shot at and missed all the way up and nobody injured, all the way up to a mass public shooting. Now, one of the things that was interesting was that the FBI said of these 302 attacks, 14 of them were stopped by civilians with permanent concealed handguns, for about 4.6%. When I was at the Department of Justice, I noticed that they had missed a lot of cases involving civilian. Basically, all the cases they missed were cases where civilians with concealed handguns had stopped the attack. They had missed about 150 of those. And they had also misclassified some cases, like the White Settlement Church shooting near Fort Worth in December 2019. They classified the person as a security guard when in fact he was just a parishioner there. In fact, they had a lot of parishioners who were carrying that day. But you don't need to take my word for it. At the bottom, there's a link there. If you go tiny URL and just type in missing FBI active shooting cases, you can go and see news reports there, and you can go and see whether on your own whether or not they match the FBI definition of those things. But rather than about 4.6%, you find almost 40% of the active shooting cases were stopped by civilians. But whether you take the 302 or 440 over those 9 years, either one of those, even with a lot of these cases just involving a gun being fired and nobody hit, it's way below the Gun Violence Archive numbers. Now, there's another point to bring up, and that's something that we've touched on briefly, and that is whether these attacks were occurring in places where people were allowed to have guns or not, so-called gun-free zones. And when you're talking about law-abiding citizens stopping these attacks, you can't really expect this civilians to stop, law-abiding civilians to stop attacks in places where it's illegal for them to have guns. So if you look at the data for 2022, the FBI says about 6% of the active shooting cases were stopped by law-abiding civilians. If you have the corrected numbers that are there, I think it's about 41%. But if you separate out cases where they were legally able to carry guns versus ones they weren't, you're talking about almost 64% of the cases. Now, one claim that you very frequently hear is that guns are the leading cause of children's deaths. I just have a couple of quotes here. Vice President Harris last June, for example, said the #1 cause of death of children in America is gun violence. And last year, about the same time, the White House tweeted out, guns are the #1 killer of children. And I could give you about 24 statements from President Biden about that. So you can go to the Centers for Disease Control website, their Wickers report, and they have very detailed data for all sorts of ages. But so if you look at children, define a child as somebody under 18, and you can look at motor vehicle deaths, you can look at firearm deaths. And so, first of all, I'm just going to look at the blue and the orange lines that are there. The blue are motor vehicle deaths. You can see for 2019, for example, there were 2,200 motor vehicle deaths for children under 18. There were almost 1,700 firearms deaths. And you can see it for the other years, 2020 and 2021. Now, when I talked to you all before, one of the things I mentioned to you was the difference between homicide and murder. It's never really been obvious to me why people use homicide, but homicide involves murders plus justifiable homicides, and why you want to lump together murders and justifiable homicides. So a murder is a rapist who kills his victim. Justifiable homicide would be the potential rape victim defending herself and shooting the rapist before he can attack her. And those seem like very different types of cases to me. And if you look at murders rather than homicides, you can see, for example, in 2019, you have 2,200 motor vehicle deaths, but you have about 1,400 firearm deaths for murders, accidents, and suicides. And you can see that gap in the other years. So what's the point of pushing this myth, okay? And I think the main point of pushing it is the idea is if you could just simply get rid of guns, you'd reduce these deaths. And you and I talked about this some when I was here in January, and that is every place in the world that's banned either all guns or all handguns has seen murder rates actually go up every single time. You'd think out of randomness, once or twice it would go down. And yet every single time it's gone up. So getting rid of all guns or banning guns, because it's basically, and the reason for that increase is that it's basically the most law-abiding citizens who you're primarily going to be taking guns away from. You may take a few guns away from criminals, but if you're primarily disarming law-abiding citizens, you may make it relatively easier for criminals to go and commit their types of crimes. And as we talked about, you know, it's about as difficult to stop drug gangs from getting a hold of guns as it is to stop them from getting a hold of the illegal drugs that they sell. So, and how about with suicides? Well, you know, obviously places like Washington, D.C. and Chicago have banned handguns for a while. Well, what happened to suicides? Well, firearm suicides went down. The most suicides are committed with handguns, but total suicides actually increased a little bit. I'm not going to go and argue that it increased suicides, but it surely didn't drop it. In fact, every single place in the world that's banned either all guns or all handguns has seen essentially no change in total suicides. They may see changes in firearm suicides, but people switch. And one of the problems is that people often only look at firearm suicides, but it seems to me what you should care about is what happens to total suicides. And yet people find other ways, apparently pretty close substitute ways of committing suicide. So anyway, so what, here's another myth that we can talk about, and that is murder rates are worse in Republican states. It's basically Gavin Newsom from California kind of got this started. Anyway, here's just a couple quotes from media headlines. Politico, gun violence worse in red states. It's not even close. Forbes, red states have higher gun deaths than blue states. And it's true, if you look at 2020, the states that voted for Trump had a higher murder rate than the states that voted for Biden. When they had these news reports, the data for 2021 was already out, and for some reason people didn't look at that, but the reverse was true. The murder rate was higher in the states that voted for Biden than the states that voted for Trump. But there's a more important point to make here, and that is law enforcement and generally the judiciary system is a local issue. The number of police you're going to hire, the policing policies are determined by local governments. District attorneys, like for Cook County, are elected locally. Kim Foxx was elected locally. So her decision who to go and charge for crimes, whether to go and ask for bail or not, are decisions that her office makes. Judges are elected locally. They're the ones who determine the sentences. They're the ones who will agree to what bail should be set for the individuals that are there. And so I would argue that overwhelmingly, the law enforcement activities are local decisions. And so go and look at how murder rates vary locally. So even if you take the data for 2020, you find that the counties that voted for Biden had a much, much higher murder rate than the counties that voted for Trump. And that's true whether you look at all counties or you look at large counties over 100,000 or 200,000 in population, you're going to see this a similar breakdown. And you can break it down by the counties in the states that voted for Biden and the counties that voted in the states that voted for Trump, and you see a similar breakdown. In fact, in the states that voted for Trump, it's very heavily driven by those counties in those states that voted for Biden. So I'll give you a couple examples. You look at Louisiana, for example. The overall murder rate in Louisiana is relatively high. It's about 12 per 100,000, but it's overwhelmingly driven by Orleans Parish, which is the parish, the county for New Orleans, where the murder rate is about 50 per 100,000. It's also, to a lesser extent, driven by Baton Rouge, which is very similar. In Missouri, they also have a murder rate over 10 per 100,000. But again, St. Louis County has a murder rate of about 50 per 100,000, and that's driving the total for the state. Now, often when people talk about the U.S. murder rate, I would argue it's fairly misleading because unlike most other countries, murders in the United States are extremely heavily concentrated in tiny areas. 2% of the counties in the United States, about 60 counties, account for about 23% of the U.S. population, but they account for 56% of the murders. The five worst percent of the counties account for about 76% of the murders. And if you look within those 2% of the counties, for example, almost 2/3 of their murders occur within 10-block areas. Murders in the United States are extremely heavily concentrated in tiny areas, and it overwhelmingly has to do with gang activity, particularly drug gang activity. By contrast, 54% of the counties have 0 murders. Another 15% of the counties have 1 murder. So about 70% of the counties in the United States have either 0 or 1 murder. And as I say, 5% of the counties account for 76% of the murders that are there. Now, I'd like to go through some simple things on mass public shootings, just to get into a little bit more detail. We often hear about things like AR-15s or whatever. 56% of the mass public shootings over the last 25 years don't involve solely involve rifles of any type, whether it's a hunting rifle or any type of rifle. Slightly less than 15% involve only handguns. And you can see other combinations of guns. The most deadly attacks aren't assault weapons. The most deadly attacks are attacks that involve multiple types of guns, handguns, rifles, and shotguns. If you look at mass public shootings, they overwhelmingly occur in places where guns are banned. And you can go to our website at crimeresearch.org. We have quotes from diaries and manifestos where time after time, these mass murderers explain why they picked the targets that they did. They may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. Their goal is to go and kill as many people as possible so they can go and get media attention. And they know if they go to a place where guns are banned, they'll be the only people with a gun there. One of the frequent claims that we hear is the dangers from white supremacists or what have you. Whites make up a majority of the mass public shooters, though they are less than their share of the population. Non-Middle Eastern whites make about 59% of the US population. They make up 54% of the shooters. Blacks make up 13% of the US population. They make up slightly more than that, their share of the mass shooters, about 16%. Hispanics are way underrepresented. Hispanics make about 18% of the population. They make up about 10% of the shooters. Middle Eastern whites make up about 6% of the shooters, but only about 1% of the population, so they're overrepresented. And Asians are also overrepresented. If you look at the race of the victims, for whites, they're almost identical to their share of the shooters, 54 point something percent to 55%. Blacks are underrepresented in terms of their share of the victims, rather than 13% of the population. They make up about 10% of the victims. Hispanics are very close to their share of the population. So they're overrepresented relative to their share of the mass shooters. And non-Middle Eastern whites are slightly underrepresented in the share of the victims, even though they're overrepresented in terms of the shooters. As far as the age distribution, we very frequently hear about young people, but they are not overrepresented. The most likely group overrepresented wise are 21 to 25-year-olds. The next group is 36 to 40, and then 41 to 45, and then you have 16 to 20. Now, one thing that I find interesting is because we very frequently hear about mental illness discussions, is that slightly over half of the mass murderers were actually seeing mental health care professionals within 6 months of their attack. Yet in not one single case did these mental health care experts identify any of these individuals as a danger to themselves or others. And some of these experts were internationally renowned experts, like the Santa Barbara mass murder. He was seeing 3 mental health care experts. One of them was the head of child psychiatric services at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, an internationally recognized experts on youth violence. And if you read the diaries and manifestos for these mass murders, you get some idea why these mental health care professionals are unable to identify these individuals. Mental health depends upon the model where people voluntarily go and seek help. These guys aren't looking for help. I'll give you a couple examples. The Buffalo mass murder from about 1.5 years ago. When he was in school, a teacher had asked him what he was going to be doing over the summer. And he said, well, he's going to find a school and he's going to shoot it up and then he's going to go and commit suicide. Obviously, the teacher was concerned. The teacher flagged him. He went and saw 2 mental health care professionals. but he told the mental health care professionals that he was just joking, that he wasn't serious about it. It was a bad joke, a stupid joke. He shouldn't have said it, and he apologized. And the mental health care professionals just took him at his word and said, he's not a danger to himself or others. That's the type of thing you see over and over again, where the mental health care professionals just take these murders at their word. So unless they're incredibly stupid and go and tell the public health experts that they're going to go and kill people, they basically don't run into any problems. You have people like the Santa Barbara killer was in his diaries was talking about how easy it was just to go and tell these mental health care professionals that he wasn't planning on doing anything, and they let him go on it. One of the things that you see brought up after these mass public shootings is the call for background checks on the private transfers of guns. After the Valdi report came out finally in January of this year, President Biden listed background checks on the private transfers of guns as his number one solution that he wanted to have to these mass public shootings. You can look it up. The Uvalde attack wouldn't have been stopped by having background checks on the private transfers of guns. Nobody in the press asked him about it, though. And why you're bringing this up as a solution for Uvalde when it obviously wouldn't have had an effect there. But it's not just that. All the mass public shootings this century, none of them, even if the law had been in place and been perfectly enforced, would have been stopped. And yet, for some reason, it keeps on being brought up. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about background checks, because everybody wants to stop bad people, dangerous people from being able to go and obtain guns. The problem is that the current system is a mess, and one frequent claim you'll hear from President Biden and others is that background checks have stopped 4 million dangerous or prohibited people from buying guns. And that's simply false. What they should say is that background checks have, you've had initial denials of 4 million people. But that's very different than saying you're stopping dangerous people from doing it. Basically, you're talking about false positives. It's one thing to stop a felon from buying a gun. It's another thing to stop somebody simply because they have a roughly phonetically similar name and similar birthday to a felon. And the problem is that these errors overwhelmingly occur against minorities. People tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. Hispanics have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. 34% of black males are felons. You have 18% of Hispanic males are felons, 6% of white males are felons, 3% of Asian males are felons. So who are you most likely to have these false positives? You're going to be most likely to have them when you're talking about comparing, Hispanic males or black males, where law-abiding males are simply more likely to have a roughly phonetically similar name and similar birthday to somebody who's prohibited. And people who have worked in the systems know these errors. I have a quote there from Reagan Dunn, who was the first person who ran Project Safe Neighborhoods. If private companies did background checks in the same way that the federal government does, they'd be sued out of existence under federal law. If they had an error rate that was 100th the error rate that the federal government has. And, there's an easy fix to this. All you have to do is have the federal government have to meet the same standards for doing background checks that private companies have to meet. No private company would go and look at roughly phonetically similar names and similar birthdays to go and determine whether you might be prohibited from being able to go and have a gun. But gun control groups will fight against having the federal government have to meet the same standards. There's another issue that's similar, and that is the cost of the background checks. In Washington, D.C., where they're voting on it, it costs $125. You'll see them ranging across states from anything from $56 to $225. California is one outlier where it's $20, but that's because there's a price control. You're not allowed to charge more than $20, even though it costs on average about $80 for them to do that. And you can't refuse to do a background check or they'll take away your firearms license. So it's just a way of imposing taxes on dealers to try to drive some of them out of business. But here's the deal. As an economist, I would say you should go and, well, let me back up a second. You believe that background checks reduce violent crime, okay? Well, if you believe that background checks reduce violent crime, presumably it reduces it for everybody, not just the law-abiding person who's going out of their way to find a dealer to go and transfer the gun to somebody else. And as an economist, I would say the people who benefit should be the ones who pay for it. If everybody benefits in terms of reduced crime, pay for it out of general revenue. Don't make the law-abiding citizen who's trying to obey the law have to bear the full burden of that fee that's there. In addition, if you want somebody to do this because you think it's good, you don't tax them. You don't make them pay a big fee. If anything, you reward them for doing it, but you surely don't make them have to pay a big fee. And so do you think making people have to pay $125 or $100 or $80 encourages them to go and do the background check? And the answer is no. So again, I would go and argue, pay for it out of general revenue. So often in the gun control debate, you'll hear gun control proponents say they just want reasonable regulations. I'm happy with background checks. I just want reasonable fixes for it. Get rid of the mistakes. There's no reason that 99% of the people who are trying to buy guns are unfairly stopped from being able to go and do so. Now, you can appeal, but most people are going to have to hire a lawyer. You're talking about $3,000 on up to go and hire a lawyer to get that fixed. You're basically talking about middle class and poor Black and Hispanic males that are being discriminated against and stopped from errors in the system through no fault of their own. And, these fees, $125 or $100 might not stop you or I from getting a gun, but the very people that my research indicates who benefit the most, the people who are the most likely victims of violent crime, poor Blacks who live in high crime urban areas, making them have to pay, another $100 just for the background check, may make the difference between whether or not they're going to be able to legally obtain a gun. Democrats often will talk about voter IDs and how even free voter IDs are onerous for poor minorities and prevent them from being able to go and vote. Well, if a free ID stops people from voting, obviously you have to have an ID for buying a gun, and that's not free. Plus you have to pay these other fees. What do they think is happening in those cases? So I would argue, and I've told gun control people for 25 years that they could easily get these background checks on private guns transfers passed if they made two changes. Had the federal government have to meet the same standards for doing background checks that private companies have to meet, and pay for the cost of these background checks out of general revenue. So anyway, let me just give you an example of the costs of fees and the impact that they have on gun ownership. So you're in Illinois. In Illinois, about 4% of the adult population has a concealed carry permit. In neighboring Indiana, now it's actually 23%. I need to update that. Why the difference? Well, to go to get a concealed carry permit in Illinois, the total cost for a 5-year permit is about $450 when the fee and the training. In Indiana, it literally costs $0. You don't have to pay a fee. There's no you don't have to pay for the background check. The background check's free. So you make it more costly, fewer people do it. Price of apples go up, people buy fewer apples. But it's much more than that. It also changes the mix of people who get permits. Who gets permits in Illinois? When you're talking about $450 and 16 hours of training and stuff like that, you're basically talking about people who live in the suburbs. In Indiana, you see a much, much higher rate of permits in heavily poor, heavily minority zip codes. Well, if you're going to reduce crime, it's just not the percent of people with permits, because the more people with permits, the riskier it is for criminals to go and commit crimes. But it's also who has the permits. If I have a suburb where there's no crime and I have 100% of the population with permits, you're not going to see any reduction in crime. You have to have the people who are the likely victims of crime, where the crime's occurring, get the permits. So in Illinois, not only do you have few people with permits, but it's people with permits in areas where there's little crime. In Indiana, you're going to see a much bigger reduction in crime from letting people carry concealed handguns, because in Indiana, they have the rules set up so that poor Blacks and Hispanics who live in high crime areas are able to go and get permits. So you have, the irony is, in Illinois, Democrats control the entire process of the permit rules, and they claim that they care about poor and minorities, but who do they think they're stopping with the cost of $450 to be able to go and get a permit to be able to go and carry, on top of all the other fees that you have in terms of the background checks, in terms of the FOID card, in terms of everything else that you have here in Illinois for people to be able to go and carry. I can just show you, here's an example from Texas. Texas, these are the percentage of the permit holders that are Black. They've had two big changes in permit rules in Texas over this period of time. One was reducing the number of training hours from 10 to 4. You could see before that, the percentage of the population that was Black, that had of permit holders that were Black, was falling. It stopped falling as soon as they reduced the training requirement. And then when they reduced the fee from $140 to $40, you immediately saw an increase, and then an increase after that. And that's what you see in other places. Let's skip this here. So since we've been talking about mass shootings, I'm going to show you a short video, and then we can talk.
You've probably heard that America has the most mass shootings in the world. That's often given as a reason for more gun control. But economist John Lott looked into that claim, and he says it's a myth based on one bogus study.
The United States has the most mass shootings.
By far, the most public mass shootings. You don't see murder on this kind of scale with this kind of frequency in any other advanced nation on earth.
Where'd that claim come from? Obama and everyone else base it on
A study done by University of Alabama professor Adam Langford.
University of Alabama professor Adam Langford.
This is Adam Langford.
I studied 171 countries for more than 40 years, 1966 to 2012. And essentially the answer was, not surprisingly, the United States has by far the most public mass shooters.
His claim received coverage in hundreds of news stories, but all these people were misled by Langford. Langford's study claimed that since 1966, there were 90 mass public shooters in the United States, more than any other country. Langford counted 202 shooters in the rest of the world. Langford claimed complete data were available for 171 countries. But how did Langford find every shooting in all these countries, most of which don't speak English? And how did he find all the cases in the years before the internet? Few governments collect this data. Finding complete data for mass public shootings in just one developing country, say India in the 1970s, would be an incredible feat. Many of these shootings would have been reported only in local outlets, in the local language.
That shooting at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut.
On the other hand, United States mass public shootings are well documented and hard to miss. If Langford undercounted foreign cases because he missed finding old newspapers or had trouble with language barriers, his paper's entire conclusion that the United States had the most mass public shootings would fall apart.
Many journalists and researchers asked Langford for his data. Not only did he refuse to share a list of his cases, or even the number of shootings he found in each country, which are nowhere in his paper. He even refused to share an explanation for how he found those cases. That's academic malpractice. Asked if he used foreign languages to search for these shootings, Langford stated, "My data were not limited to English language searches." Asked what languages he used, Langford refused to provide that information. "This is all the assistance I can provide at this time," Langford said. Look, I've researched crime for decades, and I've published dozens of peer-reviewed academic articles on the subject. Langford won't even respond to my emails with simple questions. Now, maybe he doesn't want to talk to me because I'm well known for my research, more guns, less crime. But Langford has refused to share his list of shooters and methods, even with strong gun control advocates. This all seemed very suspicious to me. So the think tank that I run, the Crime Prevention Research Center, researched it. Unlike Langford, we took a lot of time to find all the foreign cases we could. We even got translators to identify cases using the same definition of mass public shooters Langford used. 4 more people killed in a public place, not part of some other type of crime. We found that he grossly undercounted foreign attacks. We counted well over 3,000 shooters, at least 15 times more shooters as Langford claimed.
31% of total shooters, despite the fact that we only have 5% of the world's population.
Of the 86 countries where we have identified any mass public shootings occurring, the United States ranks 62nd. Norway, Finland, Switzerland, and Russia are European countries with significantly higher rates of murders from mass public shootings.
The explanation is firearm ownership rate.
When Langford's data are fixed, there is no relationship between gun ownership rates and mass public shooters. There's a lesson here. Langford's critical but simple error could have been picked up if journalists had only demanded his data and methods before publicizing his study. Journalists should learn to be skeptical. In the meantime, we should all be skeptical of news coverage of studies like this that simply confirm what journalists and people want to hear.
Before releasing this video, I also asked Langford for his data and methods for finding shootings in foreign language media. Langford would not provide the information. You've probably heard.
Oops. Okay. Well, I appreciate your time here, and I'm happy to try to answer some questions. And just so you know, you don't have to ask just questions about my discussions either in January or now. You can also ask me questions because I know you've had other speakers, and I'm happy to try to deal with their comments that were there. So anyway, appreciate your time, and please feel free to ask me any questions.
Oh, okay. I have a question. So a lot of people, when citing like sources for anything like a statistic, they'll often cite like a media organization, like what, and like you just mentioned or showed us in the video that a lot of them, they actually are they are incorrect. So how would I where should I look for more accurate like coverage of studies?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, you can go to our website at crimeresearch.org, where, you know, what we try to do is not just tell you what the conclusion is, but try to go through and explain, you know, how the data is put together and what have you. I've been an academic most of my life. I've had positions at Stanford, University of Chicago. I was at Chicago for 5 years. I've been at Wharton, Yale, UCLA. And I've worked in the federal government. I've been chief economist for the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and I was senior advisor for research and statistics in the Department of Justice. And, you know, most people don't know what the terms mean, okay, and what they imply. I'll give you a simple example. You know, you'll frequently hear that most murders are acquaintance murders. And when people hear that, they think about people who are somehow emotionally close to each other, you know, husband and wife, boyfriend, girlfriend. Nothing could be further from the truth. Most acquaintance murders involve rival gang members. It's very common for the members of one gang to know who the members of another gang are, okay? Acquaintance murders involve prostitutes and johns or pimps. They'll involve things like, I'll give you one that will blow your mind, and that is, take a cab driver. If a cab driver is murdered by somebody who's in the back of his cab, that's classified as an acquaintance murder because there was a perceived financial relationship that existed between the two parties. If somebody comes up to the side of the cab and murders the cab driver, that's classified as a stranger murder there because there is no perceived financial relationship that existed between the parties. You know, my guess is most people have no clue, you know, what's included in the definition of acquaintance murder that's there. You know, for cab drivers, in many years, being a cab driver is the most dangerous profession in the United States. So, you know, it's, you have things like that. And, you know, earlier I talked about, you know, the definition of what a mass shooting is. You know, most people don't know, you know, how the gun violence archive is defined. They don't even know the source that the media is relying on for that. And they don't know how it differs from how the FBI will define what a mass public shooting is going to be. So, you know, anyway, that's what we try to do at our organization. But I think that's an excellent question. There are other questions, and I'm happy to take questions, not just about our stuff that we've been going over either in January or now, but I know you've had another number of other lectures that you've been given. I assume you may have questions about or how it fits in or whatever.
Anybody? Well, I had one. I was wondering about the statistic you mentioned at the very beginning about 86% of the firearms used in cops TV shows were machine guns. I was wondering, did you count, is that the number of guns or is that the number of shooting incidents in the shows that involve machine guns, or where did that number exactly come from?
So number of guns that are fired in those TV cop shows on ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox during the 2021-2022 season.
Okay, so it's the number of the firearms themselves, not the scenes.
Not the scenes. Yeah, the number of times guns are fired. 86% of those were machine guns. You know, it's just, you know, they'll talk about assault weapons and then they'll show machine gun being fired, or they'll talk about AK-47s or AR-15s. Those aren't, you know, I guess they want to convince people that the assault weapons there are machine guns, whereas, you know, they're just semi-automatic guns. Like about 85% of the guns sold in the United States are semi-automatic guns.
So we have a team.
Go
So
ahead.
sorry. I know that we have a team doing safe storage.
Oh, I'm happy to talk about safe storage.
Okay, maybe they're absent. We do have a team doing safe storage. Could you speak to that, Dr. Lott?
Sure.
The team that's looking at it are, they are thinking of ways, aside from what's already on the books, that would make child access less accessible, I would say, whether you're in foster home, whether you're in school, whether you're any place. Could you speak to the issue of safe storage and how additional legislation may or may not work and what that would look like?
Sure. Well, you know, if you look over the last decade, let's say from 2010 on, what you'll find is that there are about 30 some accidental gun deaths on average over that period of time involving children under age 10. For children under age 15, you're going to find something in the 50 range. And but even those numbers are a little bit misleading in the sense that about 2/3 of the children under age 10 who are die from accidental gunshots are actually shot by adult males, usually in their mid to late 20s. And most of those adult males have criminal backgrounds, and most are either drug addicts or alcoholics. So most of them, it's illegal for them to own guns to begin with. But the thing is, gun locks or safe storage or whatever isn't going to stop, a 29-year-old male who may be illegally owning a gun from being able to go and get access to his own gun and firing it. When you're talking about accidental gunshots in the United States, where a child accidentally fires a gun and either kills themselves or another child, you're talking about something that's going to be around 10 to 12 on average over those years. And the thing is, that's actually slightly less risky than children dying from lightning strikes. Now, with lightning strikes, I'm not going to go and tell a child to go and walk through an open field during a lightning storm with an umbrella. That would be kind of stupid to go and do something like that. But it's pretty rare. And, I would just ask you, if you were to go and think, if I didn't tell you those numbers to begin with, and you were to go and guess that most American households own guns, and the gun ownership rate is actually higher in households that have children, what would you have guessed the accidental gun death rate for children actually firing the gun and killing themselves or others would be? When I usually ask people those questions, I get numbers in the hundreds or thousands that are there, rather than what you'll find if you go to the Centers for Disease Control website and look over, the average over the last decade or something like that, because you'll get one year or another will be higher or lower. But what happens is that when you have an accidental gun death involving a child, it will get national news coverage. And I think it causes people to think they're more common than they are. How many of you have seen Bowling for Columbine? Show of hands. Okay, well, anyway, I guess it's from an earlier era. Anyway, Bowling for Columbine has a scene in it where Michael Moore talks about a 6-year-old taking a gun to school and shooting another child to death. And they interview the child's mom. What they leave out of the story is that the boy who took the gun to school, his mom was a drug addict. She was not around there. He was being raised by his uncle, who was running a crack house. And what had happened was one of the customers at the crack house had passed out in the living room floor and had his gun next to him on the floor. And the 6-year-old had picked up the gun and taken it to school with him when he had done the shooting. So even when you're talking about these 10 to 12 cases a year that are occurring, a number of those are in what you would call criminogenic type households. These are not normal households. So the rate that you're going to have these types of problems in normal law-abiding households is even lower than the numbers that I was talking about before. But here's the problem. If you require that people have to lock up their guns, and they want to have the guns locked and stored separately, you make it less able for people to access their guns for protection. When states pass those laws, what you find is that criminals become emboldened to attack people in their homes. And you actually see an increased number of deaths, an increased number of other crimes, and you don't see a drop in accidental gun deaths or suicides involving young people. Now, let me give you a simple example. We have data on what's called hot burglaries. These are burglaries that occur while they're in the dwelling. And we have data across many countries, and I'll just give you a comparison for two. Compare the United Kingdom with the United States. The burglary rate in the UK is about twice the burglary rate in the United States. 60% of the burglaries in the UK occur while people are at home. In the United States, it's 13%. Why the difference? Well, American burglars spend about twice as long casing a home before they break in compared to their British counterparts. Why do they spend so much time casing a home before they break in? Does anybody have an idea why American burglars spend so much time? And I'll give you another fact. When do burglaries occur in the United States? They overwhelmingly occur in the middle of the day. In the UK, they very frequently occur in the evening. Anybody have any thoughts on why those differences occur? Well, if you look at surveys of burglars who are in prison in both those countries, what you'll find is that burglars in the United States are worried about getting shot. So how do you avoid getting shot? Well, one way you avoid getting shot is you make sure nobody's home before you break in. And you can do that by casing the home before you break in. And also you can do that by breaking in during those times of the day when you don't think people are going to be at home. In the UK, they're not worried about that. They break in when the people are home. And one of the reasons why they break in when people are home is, let's say the person has a safe. Well, how do you get in the safe? One way to get in the safe is to force the person to tell you how to open the safe. How do you do other things. They may have other things hidden inside the home. And so they force the people there to go and tell them where the things are. So they actually have an incentive, burglars, to kind of break in normally when people are at home, because then they're more successful in stealing stuff from them. But American burglars, want to avoid people when they're in their home. So, and so the problem that you face is that these safe storage laws actually result in more deaths, result in more harm to the victims that are there. And, I understand the desire to make things safer, but, unfortunately, they have the opposite effect. And so, I would go and argue, look, does it make sense sometimes for people to lock up their guns? Of course it does. But if I live in a high crime urban area like Chicago, it may not make much sense. You may be endangering people's lives in those areas. If I live in a high crime urban neighborhood, to force them, mandate that they have to lock up their guns and store their ammunition separately.
Sure. Well, and that we know that state laws vary quite a bit depending on what part of the country you're in. As you know, where Lake Forest is, we are very close to Highland Park, where there was a shooting during the 4th of July parade. A number of faculty and staff were at the parade. And so, when someone is looking at, wow, why doesn't somebody do something? When you talk about how do you prevent something like that from happening, what is the most effective way of making sure something like that doesn't happen again?
Well, I mean, the Highland one was an unusual one with somebody shooting a rifle from a distance away. But I would recommend just read the diaries and manifestos for these mass murders. Time after time, they make it very explicit. I mean, I want somebody to provide me with a benign explanation why the media doesn't cover these things. I would think it's newsworthy to go and, if you're going to cover the diary and manifesto, to go and mention what they have in their diaries and manifestos for why they pick the targets that they do. Take something like the Nashville Covenant School shooting from last year. The Biden administration has held on to the diary. They haven't released it yet, though a few pages were leaked by some law enforcement people. But one of the things that happened was the day of the shooting, the Nashville police chief held a press conference. He had looked at the diary at that time, and he made a comment to the press that that murderer actually had another target that they wanted to go after first, the Greenfield Mall nearby, but had decided not to do it because of the presence of armed people there, people with concealed carry permits who were allowed there. and it decided to go after the school where they didn't think that there'd be anybody that could stop them. Well, that seems newsworthy to me to know that they did that. You take something like the Buffalo mass murder from the year before. The New York Times has had like 7 editorials on that attacker as Exhibit A, and they've talked extensively about his manifesto, but they don't go into what was a very long discussion in his manifesto about why he picked the target that he did. He wanted to go to a place where he knew there was strict gun control and people wouldn't have permanent concealed handguns because he was worried that if somebody had a permanent concealed handgun, they might stop him in the attack. And so that's the reason why he picked the target that he did. Now, why isn't that newsworthy? Well, you will look in vain for, I mean, there are literally dozens of these statements from these mass murderers. You will look in vain for any national media outlet to ever cover those types of things during the news cycles that are there. And, to me, it's pretty important, even if you kind of ignore the statistical evidence that I provided earlier about why these guys pick the targets that they do. But I guess the whole debate would be very different if the media would once in a while mention that we've had another attack in a place where guns are banned, would mention once in a while why these guys pick the targets that they do, or would once in a while mention all the mass public shootings that police themselves have said have been stopped by civilians carrying concealed handguns. On our website, we have a collection of 40 cases since the beginning of 2020, where police have said if it hadn't been for the presence of a permanent concealed handgun permit holder, there would have been a mass public shooting. And anyway, I could go on, but.
Well, yes, and we're wrapping up here. One of our teams is looking at the issue of foster care. Do you know of any states that disqualify a potential foster family because they have a gun in the home?
Yeah, there are many states that have done that. Many states do that. There have been some states that have had to pass rules, I believe like Tennessee and stuff, to make it so that foster parents couldn't be discriminated against based on whether they have a gun in the home. But I know Nevada, I know California, I know a number of states explicitly will not allow you to be a foster parent if you have a gun in the home.
And then regarding schools and daycare centers, I know we have a team that is looking at kind of the school environment, the educational environment. What is the best way to make sure that there are no unfortunate events that occur in that area?
Right. Well, we have a report that you can find that looks at all school shootings in the United States from 2000 on, anything from an accidental discharge all the way up to a mass public shooting. What you have to understand is that there are 20 states that allow teachers and staff to carry guns. It varies across states. Some you may only have a few schools that have it, and others like Utah and New Hampshire, any teacher with a concealed carry permit is allowed to carry. In states like Texas or Oklahoma, you may have like 40% of the public schools in the state have armed teachers and staff. And so it varies a lot, but you literally have like over 10,000 schools in the United States which have armed teachers and staff. There has never been an attack at a school that has armed teachers and staff where anybody's been injured or killed. All the school shootings where anybody's been injured or killed has occurred in those schools that ban teachers and staff being able to go and carry. And so the question that you have to ask yourself is, do you want a sign in front of the school that says this school is a gun-free zone? Or do you want a sign in front of the school that says, warning, select teachers and staff at this school are carrying and will use their guns to protect the students and others? Now, one thing I disagree with a lot of conservatives on is that they'll go and they'll say, have one uniformed police officer in each school. think of it this way. You know, we have an air marshal program, right? Do you think air marshals should be in uniform? You know, the guys who sit in the plane and are armed and fly back and forth across the Atlantic or Pacific? I assume not. Nobody that at least talks to me about it. You guys are pretty quiet there. Maybe it's because it's the team's set up here, but they say no. Of course, you don't want to have the air marshal in uniform, because all you're doing then is telling the attackers who they have to worry about, who the terrorist has to take out first. And so you don't want to give them that information, because that's big tactical information. The same thing is true with armed officers in schools. If you have somebody in uniform, you give real tactical advantages for the killers there, because they can either wait for, you know, multiple school buildings at the school. The attacker could wait for the officer to move to another building, or they could go to another building themselves, or they could try to kill that one officer first, and then have free reign to go after other people that are there. You know, and you know, the thing is, being an officer like that is very difficult job to stop these attacks, because first of all, it's an incredibly boring job. You know, we have like 90,000 schools in the United States. You know, since the year 2000, we've had 8 mass public school shootings in the United States for K through 12, another 3 for universities. You know, the risk of having a shooting in any given year is incredibly low. And so it's very hard to be on your toes all the time there. And you don't have eyes in the back of your head. Somebody could come up behind you and shoot you and take you out, and then they have free reign for the rest of the place there. If you have, okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So we love the passion and the information here. We know that you're going to share your slides with us, which we will make available to everyone here. If you and your teams have additional questions based on what you heard today or the slides, please send them to me, and then we can ask Dr. Lott to provide some additional guidance for you. Thank you again for spending this stuff